Making art and being creative really fuels our soul and can be very healing to us. And you have to jump in, and you may not know what the end will be, but you have to go with it. You have to kind of go with your gut, try different things, and see what works. My name is Faith Humphrey Hill, and I am a portrait artist that combines knitting and drawing with digital tools. And I believe it's my job as a visual artist to create an image and to share that with a viewer that conveys an emotion or ignites joy or sparks conversation. I believe visual art is communication. I knew that I was going to be an artist probably in middle school. So after high school, I enrolled in the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, where I received a BFA. And while I was there, I did a lot of oil painting and drawing. I worked in charcoals a lot, working primarily from life. So a lot of figure drawing, landscapes, still life, that sort of thing. And while I was there, I was making my art and I enjoyed the process. I absolutely loved it, but I wasn't sure what I was saying with my artwork. So I decided instead I would move into arts administration so I could always be surrounded by artists. So that led me into a career where I worked in galleries, museums, community art centers, and went on to pursue a master's in arts management. I was very much in love with what I did because ultimately if you took my positions and what the core responsibility was, it was twofold. I needed to support artists in the making of their artwork, and I needed to support the viewer in understanding and reading the artwork. So I kind of played this bridge position. So while I continued my career in the arts, working in different organizations, I continued my studio practice at home. I worked in oils and charcoal and continued working in that style. But then I also started a family and found that working in oils was really challenging with managing young children. So I primarily worked in charcoal and graphite at this time. But then I also found myself with lots of little pockets of time, right? Little 5 and 10 minutes. And I really wanted to cram in as much creativity as I could into my day. So I decided I wanted to learn how to knit. I was fueled with inspiration. I packed up kiddo, ran to Michael's, bought 2 pairs of needles, a book, and way more yarn than any beginner knitter should buy, and taught myself how to knit. And because I think, when inspiration sparks, you just kind of have to embrace it and run with it. So I was starting to make sweaters and hats, and socks were my favorite because I could do them 2 at a time while walking around and conversing with people. And I actually had always found, while I was working this way, that the drawing was lovely because I'd get in the zone and I'd really kind of get lost in it and just really focus in on the face and the features and the details, and I just loved that. But the knitting was fun because it had a social element. I could be creative while talking to people, while visiting with people, while having calls and stuff. So together, they're this really beautiful mesh of creativity, one where I can be social and interactive, and one where I can kind of get lost into myself and in the details. I was so full of inspiration and so full of ideas and concepts from all that time I spent with all those other great artists. They fueled me with all these ideas that I just needed to, I didn't know where it was going, but I knew I had to give it a shot, and I knew I had to take some time, and that would be hard, but I had to try it out. I had to spend some time in the studio, I had to ask myself the tough questions, and I had to give it a go. It was time. When I started making art full-time, I quickly landed on portraits as my subject of choice for many reasons. Most importantly, I am fascinated by people. I think they're really interesting. So down the road, I had an exhibition of my portrait artwork, and so I'm walking around the exhibition space and I'm a little nervous. So I'm knitting my socks and walking around and talking to people, keeping my hands busy. And the viewers would come up to me and they'd be like, "Oh, you're knitting. So-and-so I knew used to knit," or, "Oh, I have this hand knit garment that I love." They're just telling me all their stories about knitting. And I reflected on that when I got back to the studio. And I was thinking about the exhibit and the words that they were saying and some of the comments they were making about the knitting. And it conjured up words like hug and comfort and warmth. And I was like thinking about, well, I want those words to now be associated with the faces. I want the viewer to feel that sense of connection to them. So then I was looking for ways that I can best combine the knitting with the drawing so that I can hopefully create more of a connection there and bring the knitting in for what it visually represents. I started experimenting with a few mediums, and I was already doing the crosshatch drawing digitally, and it felt natural to me to add the knitting as an underlayer to the crosshatch drawing. And that felt natural to me for a few reasons. One, I liked the idea that the knitting wasn't physically present, because it seemed whenever somebody saw something that was physical when it was knitting, they would immediately want to touch it. And I wasn't looking for this to be a tactile, touch the object thing. It's visual art. I'm presenting a visual image. I want to bring the knitting in for what it visually represents. What does it mean? Additionally, I had found that through all of my work, there was this undercurrent theme that kept coming up, and that was this embrace of the digital. And I was reflecting on that, like, why am I so comfortable with this digital medium, and why am I so attracted to this idea that I'm taking something really traditional, like my crosshatch drawing skills, which I learned with traditional media, or the knitting, which has a very deep history, and utilize all these digital tools to kind of bring it all together. And I, sort of discovered about myself that it was my personal history that was coming out in the work, and I felt that that was very honest. So when I was a teenager, I had scoliosis surgery, and they put 2 rods in my back. And then a few years later, had heart surgery, and they put a little metal device in my heart. So I live my life with hardware within me. I am part organic, but I'm also part engineering and tools and technology. I am a hybrid, so it would make sense that the art that I communicate with the world is a hybrid as well. So when I set out to start a portrait drawing, the first thing I do is I look for a reference photo. And my favorite resource for this is an artist-to-artist resource that is sort of a social media. So artists go on there and they share snapshots and little photos they've taken for other artists to use in their artwork. So it's all free and available to use. And it's a worldwide platform. So there's people all over the globe submitting images. And then you can save different reference photos that you like and then use them in your artwork. I think today I will be drawing this face. What I like about using reference photos is that instead of coming up with someone from my imagination, I get to know a real person, and I get to really understand who they are and observe them and really pay attention to the nuances of their different features. So I'm going to open up a new canvas. And I'm going to actually, for this piece, demonstrate for you a technique to transfer your photo over. So it's called the doodle grid, or some people call it the scribble grid. And what I like about it is it can help you you can use it in traditional media as well. And it can help you take a photo and sort of enlarge it for something if you were gonna do a mural or work on a larger canvas. Or if you're working digitally like I am, it's helpful if you're working on a tight deadline or your commission. I think as opposed to tracing the photo or using the grid method, I find that the doodle grid still trains your eye to see the proportions and the relationship between all of the features. And it retains a lot of your natural mark making, which is what the most important thing with creating art. You don't want things to look static. You want them to have life and energy. And the way we make marks with our hands really conveys that. And so I think this is a really helpful method to do that. And so what you do is you take your canvas, if it's a literal physical canvas or a wall, or in this case a digital canvas, and you just make a bunch of marks on it. So you'll take your canvas and make a bunch of marks on it. So I might make a star and a square and a circle. And I'll say I love art. You're really just scribbling by hand anything that you want to make. You can say TDN. You can make a little palette shape. Doesn't matter, anything. Okay? Then what you're going to do is you're going to insert a photo, and I'm going to insert this photo of the person I'm going to draw. I'm going to put it into the canvas as a new layer above the doodle. Now I'm going to lower the opacity. So now I have my reference photo of her overlaid over the doodle, because then you can go ahead and start sketching that in. So I don't use this method all the time, but it is really helpful, and you still have to, I still find myself doing a lot of proportional relationships where you're using your pencil to measure the distance. What's the distance of her hairline here? How does that angle relate to the angle of her eyebrow? So you're still doing a lot of those very traditional freehand techniques, and you're retaining a lot of your natural mark making with this method, but it just kind of speeds up the process a little bit with getting the right proportion in place. And it's especially helpful if I'm out in the field doing a mural or something. I prefer to draw my portraits when I'm out and about around a lot of people. You know, I hear their voices. I know I can see them moving around, and I feel like the finished object, the finished piece, becomes this sort of mix between myself and all the people around me. So once the piece is completed and I finish drawing it, I will take the under layer, which is just sort of this mess of color, and I will export it. So I like to use an app to make the knitting pattern that I'm going to knit off. This piece is going to be turned into a knit print. I need to create the knitted layer that will go underneath my crosshatch layer. So I've taken that under painting layer, I've saved it into my photos, and I'm going to import it now into Stitch Sketch. I'm going to choose my image, and I'm going to mark color priority. So then I'll go through my stash of yarn, try out some different colors, switch some things. Sometimes I go with what the computer and the app suggested. Oftentimes I'll change it. I'll put them in, put them behind the crosshatch layer to see how those colors play with the crosshatch colors. I use really bold colors because I want there to be life and energy in my portraits. All right, so I'm pleased with the way this one looks. So I'm all ready to get started. I think I'm gonna go with this color palette for my knit prints. I then export the knitting pattern as a PDF and put it into my notes so that I can reference it and knit from it. Now that I have the knitting pattern all set, it's time to move over to the knitting machine. I put my yarn in front of me, roughly from lightest to darkest, darkest being my purple, and I load up my bobbins with the different colors. So this knitting machine dates from the roughly late 1950s, early 60s, and it wasn't really built for color work. So I'm figured out some ways to hack it so that I can do a 4-color knit print on it. So on my bed, I've added some colored paint every 10 stitches. Now I'm gonna take those lines and replicate it onto my pattern here. This will help me keep track of where I am in my piece. So now that I have my pattern all set and it's all marked in colors that relate to what's on my bed, it's time to cast on. So to cast on the knitting machine, what I'm gonna do is I'm starting on the orange line right here. And I always give myself just 5 extra stitches as sort of a border for my knit print. So this is where my print is going to sit. And we cast on by pushing forward with the needle pusher every other needle on the bed. I pull down some yarn that I have on my tension rod. This is gonna give me a border, a bottom border for the portrait. And I move across the bed. Then I'm gonna take my cast on comb and hang it from those stitches. And then my claw weights to add even more tension, because just like knitting by hand, tension is everything. Now I'm gonna pull all of those forward. And I'm gonna knit about between 5 to 10 rows of just plain white knitting. Again, just so I have a nice white border at the bottom of my piece. Now we're gonna remove this, clip it there. Now it's time to work on the pattern. And I'm gonna take my bobbins, which have all my colored yarn, and I'm gonna tie the ends onto the fabric that I've made so far. When you're working with a knitting machine, some things are a little funny. The piece grows down the machine, and also you're always looking at the reverse of the work. So you're gonna see all the really long floats. What I do would never work if I were making a functional object like a sweater, because you would never want long strands of yarn like that on the back of your sweater. But because I'm making artwork, it's okay. So now that I have the first two colors on this side attached, it's time to knit up the piece. Now I've had to sort of figure out a system as to how I can color work on this machine because it's not built to do color work. And it includes pressing in the two buttons here so it only picks up the needles that I push all the way to the front on the bed. So at the moment I don't have any needles that are pushed up to the front. If I have these two buttons pressed and I move the carriage across the bed, it's not gonna knit anything. Okay. My second color is pink, and we do have pink on the first row of our knitting. So I'm gonna hold it up and kind of pull it back a little bit. So it's as if it were coming from the tension rod. And I will select the colors. I see that I have pink just one step in from the purple, this pale purple, and then one stitch before the dark blue. So these are the ones on this first row that are gonna be pink. I pull them all the way to the front. My two buttons are pressed in. My bobbin is full of the correct color, and I'm holding it back. And now I move across, and it's just knitting those stitches in pink. My next color is blue, so now I continue. I thread it with the blue yarn, select my blue stitches. I have 3 on this side of the blue line, 1 on the other side, 6 by the yellow. So those are the stitches that need to be blue. I hold it up, move it across the machine. Now those stitches have been done in blue. And now we do the dark purple. So these are all the stitches that need to be purple. I pulled them all the way out, fold up my bobbin, move it across. Now, purple was my last color, it was my darkest. So I have finished the first round, the first line of the pattern. Now I take a little dark highlighter and I cross off the first row. And then we continue like that. So my piece is nearing completion, and as you can see, we see the reverse of the piece. We see the back. And you can see all these really long floats that, again, wouldn't be functional if this was a wearable piece of knitting, but it's not, it's art, so those will work just fine. So we finished knitting the piece, finished all 50 rows, and now we are going to knit some more white as a border to the piece, and then we will bind off. And then we move on to blocking. After you finish knitting really anything, whether it be mittens or a sweater, or in this case, the knitted artwork, you need to do an act called blocking. And what this will do is it will even out all of your stitches and keep your edges from curling as much. So I'm first gonna just relax the fibers a little bit with the steam. And I make sure, because this is for artwork and it will be photographed, I make sure that my pins lie really flat so I don't get funny shadows on my piece. So now that I've gotten it good and flat, nice and even, I'm ready to take a picture of it so that I can bring it back into the iPad and layer it with my crosshatch drawing. And I just use my phone and just make sure I have it lined up really good, nice and still, and snap a picture. And then I can move on to the iPad. So now that we photographed the piece, I've brought it into my iPad, and I've brought it in as a new layer into my artwork. I have the line drawing layer still visible so I can make sure it's lining up just as I need it to. And then I'll bring in the crosshatch layer. In this case, I made a copy of the crosshatch layer. So this was the original crosshatch layer, and I made a copy of it. And I just altered it a little bit, places where I wanted a little bit more contrast, a little bit more color, you know, doing the art of it, making sure it has the dynamic appeal that I want. And there we go, there's the finished piece. So transitioning from being an arts administrator to a full-time artist was scary. Leaving something I loved so much to make art full-time, which could be an unknown because it's not a straight path. You have to be really agile about how you support that effort and how you earn income from it. So it's a risk to switch over and do that. So when I started my art business, I decided to call it Dartily. So it's a made-up word where I amassed together the words art and daily and put them together to make the word Dartily. So in my art business, I earn income from several different sources. Sometimes publications will hire me to do an illustration for them. Sometimes I get paid to write articles for magazines about my work and my art. I do commissions. I get hired by knitting magazines and applications to produce and knit up garments and things for them, for their patterns. I also get grant funding and money from art sales, through online sales, in-person sales, and that sort of thing. And I also get paid to do artist residencies, where I'll go to an organization and create art on site and do workshops and programs with them. So there's a lot of different things that come together that are all aligned with the artwork that I create that help me support what I do. So with my knit prints, I entered that series knowing what I wanted to make. I had a vision. I knew I wanted to have the crosshatch with the knitting combined in some way. And I wasn't sure what they would think of these drawings that now have knitting involved. And so it took a little, I had to kind of boost myself up, I know, I really think this is gonna be interesting. I really wanna explore this. So the first couple, are a little different than how they look now, but I, released them out there and showed people and got their response. And it took a while, but eventually people started responding very positively to them. I, ended up having some exhibitions then. I went to some yarn fairs. The knitting community was very supportive. They were very excited about seeing that medium used in a very different way than they're used to seeing it. So that was really exciting to have this deep-rooted connection with the fine art community that I had, but now be embraced and have this connection now with the knitting community. I think if I had to point out one element that really helped me build up my art business and brand, I think it would be being brave enough to put my artwork out there and to not be afraid of trying new social media platforms. It's scary when you're making art and you're not sure if it's working or not. You kind of feel really good about it, but you're not sure if the audience is gonna understand, and you just put it out there. But it's been really helpful to get that kind of creative feedback in the conversation, and to also see those efforts really turn into jobs and paid programs where I can help support the art making that I'm doing. So I think when you're looking to make visual art a full-time venture and a business, I think it's important to stay true to yourself and your voice, and to really be genuine about the kind of work that you want to be making. Don't feel guilty for playing and experimenting with lots of art mediums. I think sometimes it's easy for us to label ourselves as, I'm this kind of artist. But it's important that we try and experiment with things, because even if it's not clear to us at the moment how it's going to come in and work into our work, it might just pop in later, and it might be the exploration that you needed. So don't be afraid to play. There are so many different ways that you can make a living being an artist. You could be in art fairs, you can do commercial work, you can work with clients, you can do commissions, you can be in galleries, you can be in museums, you can get money from grants. It goes on and on. no one is better than the other. If you're producing art and you love doing it and it fills you with joy, and you have found an audience who loves it and embraces it, then you win. That's great. There's none of those are better than the other. And I think that's really important to remember.